Hello, how are you doing? I hope you are doing well. Welcome aboard the radio learning program Ready to Learn, produced by Rwanda Education Board with support from UNICEF and in collaboration with Inspire, Educate and Empower Rwanda. I am Teacher Charles, your teacher of history as usual. I am calling upon all Senior 1 students to get their history notebooks, sit next to your radio, and we learn together. Our today's lesson is very interesting. Our today's lesson is about transatlantic slave trade. Previously, we talked about trans-Saharan trade, its factors, causes, effects, organization. Now today we are going to be looking at transatlantic slave trade. I want you to take that distinction. The previous one was about trans-Saharan trade, but today's lesson is about transatlantic slave trade. So we want to see the reasons for the rise, for the expansion, and the growth of transatlantic slave trade. So basically this was about slaves across Atlantic Ocean. This was basically about slaves. So we want to look at the reasons or factors for its rise, for its growth, its expansion. All right, I want you to listen attentively to this short background before we go to the reasons for its rise. The transatlantic slave trade was the trade which involved Europe, West Africa, and the West Indies or America. When we talk of West Indies, we mean America. By then, now it is out of these states where America came from. So it was between Europe, or it involved Europe, West Africa. When we talk of West Africa, we talk of West African states. And the West Indies. It was also called the triangular trade. In other words, it was in the form of a triangle. When we talk of a triangle, you understand that shape. A triangle, it was also referred to as triangular trade. So if you meet a question about triangular trade and another question about transatlantic slave trade, they all mean the same. So you may be asked reasons for the rise of triangular trade, or in the next, others may be asked reasons for the rise of transatlantic slave trade, or mean the same. This was because I'm explaining why it was also called triangular trade. It was called triangular trade because the ships used made 3 stages in the course of their journey. That is, from Europe to West Africa, America, and back to Europe. This made the shape of a triangle. So you can draw a shape of a triangle, Europe to West Africa, to West Indies, and back to Europe. The origin of transatlantic slave trade can be traced to as early as 1441. It started when Gonçalves, a Portuguese explorer in West Africa, took 10 slaves to Portugal. He took them initially as missionary trainees, but later turned them to be slaves. The slaves looked energetic. This marked the beginning of the triangular trade. You can get it. Initially, a Portuguese explorer by the names of Gonçalves, or a Portuguese explorer in that sense by the names of Gonçalves, took only 10 West African able-bodied men as missionary trainees. They were to be trained for missionary purposes. But when taken, they were later turned to be slaves. They were found to be energetic, hardworking, and it gave these whites an opportunity to fetch much more into it so that they can get labor from the slaves. So that is a short background about the transatlantic slave trade or the triangular trade. So I encourage you to have your pens on your notebooks. Write these factors down. When we talk of a point, we mention it and explain. Simply jot it down in your notebook, as we have always done for the past lessons. Please make sure you write these notes down. Let's now discuss the factors for the rise and expansion or growth of triangular trade. 1. The Industrial Revolution in Europe. The Industrial Revolution in Europe. We want to see how did the Industrial Revolution in Europe contribute to the rise of triangular trade. Industrialists needed raw materials and market for their manufactured goods. The Europeans resorted to Africans for market. In return, they obtained slaves who were sold to Europeans for European plantation owners in exchange for raw materials. So you can get this, that with the development of industries in Europe, a lot of manufactured products were produced, and now these industrialists, of course, needed raw materials to always feed the industries to produce more products, and even market. And even in West Africa, there was a market for them, so they had to bring their products in West Africa, and they would get slaves in exchange with the goods that they provided to the Western people or West African people. So the Europeans had plantations from where to get raw materials, and the labor to work in those plantations would be got from Africans. So they had to take Africans because they had looked at them as energetic to work in their plantations, hence leading to the growth of transatlantic slave trade. The next reason or factor, the discovery of America and West Indies by Spain in 1492. The discovery of America and West Indies was one important factor. The subsequent occupation of these areas by other European countries was another factor. Both factors led to the rise and growth of transatlantic slave trade. I hope you can get this factor here, that the discovery of America and West Indies, they were occupied by very many people, and with their discovery, they needed people to establish, to start it, to work on it. So when they were established or discovered, it led to the rise of slave trade, as slaves were raided in West Africa to go and work in those newly established or discovered states. The next reason for the rise of transatlantic slave trade was the decline of trans-Saharan trade. The decline of trans-Saharan trade. This led to the rise of Atlantic slave trade. How? That is what we want to look at. There was constant demand for slaves and commodities thereafter. So as trans-Saharan trade collapsed or declined, there was constant need or demand for slaves. So this made it possible for people to practice it, to restart it again, because it had declined with the decline of trans-Saharan. So they started now selling or raiding humans and trafficking them and selling them, leading to the rise of transatlantic. The next was the introduction of armed conflicts in African politics. The introduction of armed conflicts in African politics. This prompted the need to acquire European arms and ammunitions. So with conflicts within African politics, the African leaders or chiefs or people, because they are reviling against others or they are fighting against others, so they wanted weapons, guns, firearms, ammunitions to use to wage wars against their enemies. And for them to acquire these guns and ammunitions, they had to sell their fellow human beings to Europe for them to get guns for exchange. So with the rise of armed conflicts in African politics, it contributed to the rise of transatlantic slave trade, as Africans were exchanging humans with weapons. All right, I hope you are noting them down in your notebooks. So far, we have looked at 4 factors. I want you, please, to have them down in your notebooks. So far, we have looked at 4, and we are continuing. I hope you are still listening. The next factor for the rise of triangular trade was that the trade was profitable. The profits gained. The trade was profitable to the Europeans and Africans who were involved in it. For example, African chiefs and other participants got European goods which were of high value. So with that, they had to raid their fellow humans and sell them as slaves, hence leading to the rise of transatlantic slave trade. The next reason for the rise of triangular trade, that there was a desire by African chiefs to get wealth and political power. So the point here is political power and wealth. So the African chiefs wanted to gain wealth and political power. And for these reasons, they had to involve themselves in slave trade. They had to sell their fellow human beings to the Europeans so that they can obtain and acquire arms. When we talk of firearms, the guns and ammunitions. And even that this trade could help them in maintaining friendship with Europeans. So for African chiefs who desired to gain popularity in politics, in power, who desired to have wealth, they had to practice it, they had to get involved in it for them to strengthen their relationship with the Europeans who would support them. Even they would want to get firearms and ammunitions in exchange so that they can use these firearms and ammunitions to strengthen their positions or their power, hence leading to the rise of transatlantic slave trade. Next reason, in addition to the above, there was growth of new merchants in Europe as feudalism was declining. When we talk of merchants, these are the business people, the industrialists, the middlemen, in short, the business people. The new merchants of Europe wanted to accumulate a lot of wealth. This became a justification to participate in the triangular trade. So, for these new merchants wanted to get wealth, and for them to get wealth, they had to involve in slave trade business for them to get wealth. So the point is about the rise of new merchants who wanted to gain wealth. Next, the increased demand for certain luxurious goods. Desire for luxury, life. The increased demand for certain luxurious goods such as sugar, alcohol, beads, clothes, and mirrors. The list is endless. There are very many goods that African people desired to have from the Europeans. And for them to gain these materials, to obtain these goods, they had to exchange them with slaves. So they had to raid slaves so that they can sell them to Europeans for them to get these luxurious goods mentioned above. Next, the winds and ocean currents helped to steer the European ships to America and Asia. So the point here is the existence of winds and ocean currents. Remember, this trade was carried out across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. So the winds and the ocean currents at the sea helped to steer the European ships. Remember, the slaves were shipped in the ships, in the boats, in other words. So it helped them to steer the European ships to America and Africa. So it provided that opportunity for them to move quickly on the sea, as winds would help to direct the boats and the ships, even the wind currents. So with these, they favored the rise of transatlantic slave trade. Next, that Africans were considered, or we are considerably physically fit. In other words, the physical fitness of Africans. The physical fitness of Africans led to the rise of transatlantic slave trade. Physical fitness of Africans. That Africans could withstand harsh climatic conditions in America compared to Europeans or Asians. That Africans were physically fit. And for that fitness, that they could withstand, they could manage, in other words, the harsh conditions in America compared to the Europeans and the Asians. So this favored the rise and growth of transatlantic slave trade, because Africans were physically fit, so venture into slaves business in Africa, for Africans were fit and strong. There are very many factors for the rise, but these are some that we are discussing about today. So the last factor was the supply of firearms also led to the rise of triangular trade, the supply of firearms. So for Africans wanted to acquire firearms, when we talk of firearms, we mean like the guns and the other ammunitions. So Africans wanted to acquire firearms to defend themselves against enemies and calm down the internal wars. There were internal wars within African states, and for that, Africans wanted to have firearms to help them defend against these enemies. So for them to have firearms, they had to exchange them with slaves because they are the goods that they had. So they had to raid very many communities to get able-bodied people who would be exchanged with European guns and firearms. So with that factor of the desire to have firearms by Africans contributed to the rise of triangular trade or transatlantic slave trade. Dear students, thank you so much for listening in. I hope you put down all these factors in your notebooks. I am making a quick review, a quick summary of the main factors here. Please make sure you have them down in your notebooks. I'm just going to summarize them quickly as we conclude this lesson. So we talked of very many factors that led to the rise of transatlantic. We talked about 12 of them. Now I am making a quick summary for you. If you could have missed it, have it down in your notebook. 1. Industrial Revolution in Europe. 2. The discovery of America and West Indies by Spain. The discovery of America and West Indies by Spain. Number 3, I hope you are having them down. The decline of trans-Saharan trade. The decline of trans-Saharan trade. Next, the introduction of armed conflicts in African politics. Next, the profitability of the trade. Profitability from the word profit. The profitability of the business or of trade in that case. Desire to get wealth and political power. Desire to get wealth and political power by African chiefs. Desire to get wealth and political power by African chiefs. Next, I hope you are having them down in your notebooks. The growth of new merchants in Europe. Growth of new merchants in Europe. Next, increased demand of luxurious goods. Increased demand of luxurious goods in Africa. Increased demand of luxurious goods in Africa. Next, winds and ocean currents. Next, and the last one for this, physical fitness of Africans. Physical fitness of Africans. Thank you so much for this. I hope we have heard them now. You've put them down in your notebooks. Adding on the ones that you had, jotted them down. Thank you so much. Now have these questions for practice. There are 2 questions. I want you to carry out a research and practice them individually. 1. Draw a big triangle on a piece of paper. And on that triangle, mark the top angle as Europe. Mark the angle on your right as West Africa. And mark the angle on your left as America or West Indies. And on each angle, indicate the goods involved. After drawing that big triangle on a piece of paper, mark those 3 angles with the given places that I've given you. Europe, America, and West Africa. So at each angle, indicate goods involved, the goods that we are exchanged, the goods that we are traded in those areas. Last question. Discuss the effects of transatlantic slave trade. discuss the effects of transatlantic slave trade. Thank you so much. Bye for now. It was Teacher Charles. Bye-bye.